Colorado promotes itself on ski resorts, 14ers, and craft breweries. But scattered across the Rockies and out onto the high plains, there are towns that fell off the map entirely. Places where the money ran out, the government stepped in, or the dream simply caved in on itself like an old mine shaft. 9. Deerfield. In 1910, a black entrepreneur from Boulder named Oliver Toussaint Jackson filed on 320 acres of high plains desert in Weld County and set out to build something that had almost no precedent in the American West, a self-sufficient black agricultural colony. He called it Deerfield because the land was precious. The first settlers lived in dugouts and burned buffalo chips for fuel, and Jackson spent most of his time away from the town promoting it, leaving his wife Minerva to run things as its unofficial mayor. By 1921, Deerfield had nearly 700 residents, 2 churches, a dance hall, a restaurant, and a blacksmith who moonlighted as a fiddler. Denver's black community rode the train out on weekends to fish and dance and spend a few days somewhere that didn't treat them as second class. People came from 37 states to join the settlement, and the town was valued at over $1 million at its height, a figure that meant something different in 1921 than it does now, but was remarkable in any era. The Dust Bowl ended it. The 1930s drought collapsed the agricultural economy that Deerfield had been built on, and families left one by one. Jackson stayed, trying to sell the town as a resort, then as a prisoner of war camp, then as anything that might generate enough interest to save it. Nobody bought in. He died there in 1948, and his niece Jenny remained until 1973. The last person who still believed the land was worth staying on. A few buildings remain, a gas station, a lunchroom, the founder's house, and preservation efforts are underway, though the structures keep crumbling. The land was precious once, and the people who remember that are still fighting to prove it. 8. Gilman. Gilman sits on a 600-foot cliff above the Eagle River on the flank of Battle Mountain, visible from Highway 24 between Vail and Leadville, and completely inaccessible to anyone who doesn't own it. The town ran almost continuously from 1886 to 1984, nearly a century of silver, then lead, then zinc, then copper, and what ended it wasn't a market crash or a fire. It was the EPA. In 1984, the agency declared the ground beneath Gilman's houses, school, bowling alley, and infirmary so contaminated by a century of mining waste that the residents had no choice but to leave. They went quickly. Furniture stayed in the houses. The gas station still had the pumps. At its peak, the Eagle mine had produced over 12 million tons of ore, including zinc that was critical to the American war effort in World War II. The same extraction that quietly poisoned the water table for decades below the town. What makes Gilman different from every other Colorado mining ghost town is the timeline. People watched television here. They knew who won the 1983 World Series. The mine had produced over 12 million tons of ore and left behind 8 million tons of waste, and the groundwater had been quietly poisoned for decades before anyone with federal authority said so. The cleanup was designated a Superfund site in 1986. Developers have tried twice since then to build a ski resort on the land and backed out both times. The post office closed in 1986, the last bureaucratic acknowledgement that Gilman had ever been a functioning place. The town sits up on its cliff in plain sight, going nowhere. 7. Gothic. Gothic was a silver boom town that peaked in 1881 with around 1,000 residents, 8 saloons, a newspaper, and a dance hall. An explosion at the nearby sylvanite mine had sent pieces of wire silver raining into the surrounding fields in 1879, which was enough to start a rush. Ulysses S. Grant visited in hopes of striking it rich. The 1893 silver crash emptied the place almost overnight, and by 1928, the entire town had exactly one permanent resident, a man named Garwood Judd, who had stayed on to watch over it for 15 years, maintaining buildings and holding title for absent owners who never returned, and who became something of a local legend for it. What happened next is the part nobody expects from a ghost town. A biologist named Dr. John Johnson looked at Gothic's empty cabins and high-altitude ecosystem and saw something worth preserving for an entirely different reason. He bought the town and founded the Rocky Mountain Biological Laboratory in 1928, and it has been running ever since. Today, Gothic is home each summer to scientists from around the world studying climate change, pollination biology, and the yellow-bellied marmot population, which has been continuously tracked since 1962. The lab has become one of the most productive field research stations on Earth, attracting scientists whose work has shaped national environmental policy. The silver was a dead end. The science is ongoing. 6. Tin Cup. Tin Cup had a reputation problem from the beginning. Located at nearly 11,000 feet in a basin above Gunnison, it went through 4 sheriffs in rapid succession because the job kept proving fatal. The town's census listed 1,500 residents at its peak in the early 1880s, and a hospitality industry built almost entirely around miners who had too much money and too little to do after dark. The gunfighter culture was real and documented, and the cemetery at the edge of town accumulated residents faster than most. What the town also had, which tends to get overlooked in favor of the violence, was a legitimate and productive mining operation pulling gold and silver out of the surrounding hills for a decade, which is why it survived long enough to have a reputation at all. What remained when the ore ran out was a cluster of original structures, a cemetery that functions as an inadvertent archive of the town's violent decade, and a seasonal population of people who come up in summer to fish the Taylor River and stay in the handful of cabins that still rent. The road to Tin Cup is unpaved, the elevation discourages casual visitors, and the town has no services to speak of. The cemetery, with its markers for men who died in gunfights and avalanches and mine collapses, reads like a ledger of everything the mountain extracted from the people who came to extract from it. The people who find Tin Cup tend to come back, which is the only economic model a place like this can sustain. 5. Ashcroft. Ashcroft is 10 miles from Aspen, which makes its total disappearance even harder to explain. The town boomed in the early 1880s on silver, incorporated 2 newspapers, 20 saloons, and a school, and had every reason to become what Aspen became, a permanent settlement that outlasted the mine. Instead, Aspen got the railroad in 1887, and Ashcroft didn't. And within a decade, the difference was total. Aspen had connections to the outside world. Ashcroft had a long dirt road and a deepening quiet. At its peak, Ashcroft had been the more promising of the 2 towns, which makes the railroad's routing decision one of the most consequential pieces of infrastructure luck in Colorado history. By 1900, Ashcroft was essentially empty. It survived the 20th century as a ghost town, used by the U.S. Army's 10th Mountain Division as a training site during World War II, and later as a film location for a television series. The Aspen Historical Society has maintained it ever since, and it's now one of the most intact ghost towns in the state, with a dozen structures, including the jail, the livery stable, and a couple of saloons, all preserved within view of a 14,000-foot peak. The irony is structural. The most intact ghost town in the valley exists because it was too far from the railroad. Everything that made it fail is what kept it whole. 4. Independence. Independence was founded on July 4, 1879 by a prospector who reportedly struck gold on the holiday and named the camp accordingly, which is either a great story or a useful one. The town sat at nearly 11,000 feet on what is now Independence Pass, the route connecting Leadville to Aspen, and at its height housed around 1,500 people in a location that made winter essentially a siege condition. Snowslides were common, supplies ran short. The isolation that was tolerable in summer became dangerous in December, and the mountains that drew the miners in the first place closed around the town every year, like a fist. The town's end came in the winter of 1899, when a particularly severe series of snowstorms cut off Independence entirely, and the remaining residents ran out of food. The solution they arrived at was ingenious and slightly absurd. They stripped the siding planks off their own houses, fashioned them into skis, and organized what they formerly called the Hunter Pass Tenderfoot Snowshoe Club Race Entry Fee 1 ham sandwich, and skied down to Aspen. They never came back. The gesture of charging even a symbolic entry fee, of turning their own evacuation into an event with a name, says something about the kind of people who had chosen to live at 11,000 feet in the first place. Several log cabins with crooked corridors remain at the site, accessible in summer just west of the Independence Pass summit. The town exists now as a footnote to a ski trip, which seems about right. 3. Capital City. Capital City was founded by a man named George Lee, who had a theory that his silver claims in the San Juan Mountains were so rich that the region would eventually need its own capital, and that he was in a position to provide it. He named the town accordingly, platted a 200-acre site, built hotels, a school, a smelter, a sawmill, and a governor's mansion he constructed for himself on the assumption that statehood for the San Juan region was inevitable. At its peak in the late 1870s, around 400 people lived there and seemed to find his confidence at least partially convincing. Lee had arrived with enough money and enough certainty to make the whole project seem plausible, and for a few years, it almost was. The silver crash of 1893 resolved the debate. The territory never materialized, the capital was never needed, and the governor's mansion became the most extravagant abandoned building in Hinsdale County. The post office operated until 1920, which gives a sense of how slowly the delusion drained out of the place. Today, Capital City is accessible via the Alpine Loop and has a few standing structures, including the remnants of Lee's mansion. The distance between what he built and what actually happened is the distance between ambition and geology, and Colorado has never been particularly forgiving of men who confuse the two. It is one of the more specific documents of what happens when a man builds his ambitions into the landscape and the landscape doesn't cooperate. 2. Animas Forks. Animas Forks sits at 11,200 feet in the San Juan Mountains, which made it one of the highest inhabited towns in North America during its operating years and one of the most brutal places to spend a winter in the American West. The town ran from the early 1870s through 1920, when the Gold Prince Mill was dismantled and relocated to Eureka, and there was no longer a reason to stay. Winters here regularly buried the town under 20 feet of snow, and avalanches were a recurring fact of life rather than a rare catastrophe. What it left behind is remarkable. A collection of original buildings in Alpine Meadow, including the Duncan House, a two-story structure with a bay window that stands as the most incongruous architectural detail in a ghost town that already doesn't make sense at that elevation. The Southern Ute Indian Reservation had previously held this land before being displaced for $25,000 a year in exchange for 4 million acres, which is the context the historical markers tend not to linger on. Animas Forks is now on the National Register of Historic Places and accessible by four-wheel drive off the Alpine Loop. Local lore holds that Evelyn Walsh McLean, the mining heiress who owned the Hope Diamond, wrote her memoir in the Duncan House. The bay window still looks out over the same mountains. The elevation hasn't changed, and in a heavy snow year, the road to Animas Forks doesn't open until late June, allowing visitors in on its own schedule, same as it always has. 1. St. Elmo. St. Elmo is the ghost town that survives by not being a ghost town about itself. It has 43 original buildings, a general store that operates in summer, a town hall that functions as a museum, and enough structural integrity that walking its main street produces the specific sensation of being inside a film set, except the buildings are real, and have been real since 1880. Anton Stark stepped off a train in St. Elmo in 1881 and opened a general store. His family ran the town for 80 years, long after the railroad stopped coming and the miners left. His daughter Annabelle stayed on into the 20th century as essentially the town's sole caretaker, and her goddaughter Melanie Roth continued that preservation work after Annabelle was gone. The continuity is unbroken and improbable. The Mary Murphy mine shipped gold, silver, and copper from over 150 claims. A fire in 2002 took 6 buildings. The ones that remain are on private property, with signs indicating as much. Visitors come year-round, mostly from the direction of Mount Princeton Hot Springs, and they walk the street and feel something they find difficult to name. What they're feeling is the weight of a place that survived, not because someone decided to preserve it as a historic site, but because one family refused to leave and another family honored that refusal. The chipmunks that overrun St. Elmo in summer has become their own small attraction, brazen and numerous, indifferent to the tourists, the most permanent residents the town has left. That turns out to be harder to manufacture than almost anything else a ghost town can offer. Colorado's mining economy was built on the premise that the mountain would keep paying out. It never did. Not indefinitely. What's left are the towns that the mountain used up and set aside, some toxic, some preserved by accident, some frozen at the exact moment the money stopped. The state sells itself on the peaks. The ghost towns are what's underneath them,